Most people will spend their entire lives performing a version of themselves that was never truly theirs to begin with. They will adopt the values handed to them by parents, who inherited those same values from their own parents, who received them from a culture that had long since forgotten why those values were chosen. They will live by standards of fairness and goodness and quiet reciprocity, not because they examined those standards and found them worthy, but because they never paused long enough to ask whether the world actually operated the way they were told it did. And here is what Nietzsche understood, and what Nietzsche understood centuries before him, and what the most clear-eyed observers of human history have understood in every age. The world does not punish the cruel. It punishes the unaware. This is not a comfortable observation. It was not meant to be. When Nietzsche wrote that most men live and die without ever fully becoming themselves, he was not describing a tragedy of circumstance. He was describing a tragedy of vision, the inability to see reality as it is, rather than as we were told it should be. Most people carry around a map of human nature that was drawn in childhood, a map that depicts a world of fairness and proportion, where kindness is rewarded, and honesty is honored, and hard work is enough. And they spend their lives confused, quietly wounded, perpetually off balance, because the territory keeps refusing to match the map. What follows is not a manual for cruelty. It is not a guide for manipulation or a celebration of darkness. It is something older and more necessary than that. It is an attempt to describe the terrain as it actually exists, the psychological laws that govern how human beings actually behave when power is involved, when survival is at stake, when the comfortable story of fairness is stripped away. Nietzsche did not invent these laws. He observed them. He saw them operating in the courts and councils and streets of Renaissance Italy, and had the rare courage to write them down without apology, without softening, without the comfortable moralizing that would have made his observations easier to dismiss. He was not writing for the powerful. He was writing for the aware, for those willing to trade the comfort of illusion for the steadiness of sight. There is a distinction Nietzsche drew that matters enormously here, one that most people collapse into a false simplicity. The distinction is not between the good and the ruthless. It is between goodness with awareness and goodness without it. Goodness without awareness is not a virtue. It is an opening. It is a map with no defenses, a mind with no perimeter, a life organized around the hope that others are as honest as you are. And some are, but not all. And in the spaces where they are not, your unawareness does not protect you. It exposes you. Nietzsche called this the problem of the good man who has not yet learned that the world requires more than goodness. It requires the capacity to see clearly and respond accordingly. Nietzsche called the solution something simpler: the ability to read men as they are, not as they present themselves. The first rule Nietzsche observed, the one that quietly undermines everything else if it is not understood, is this: perception governs reality, not truth alone. This is perhaps the most disorienting truth for someone raised to believe that sincerity is its own defense. We are taught that if we are honest, if our intentions are good, if our actions are correct, then the world will respond to what we actually are. But this is not how human psychology operates. People respond to what they perceive, to what is visible, to what is performed, to what is made legible through posture and presence and the slow accumulation of impression. A man of great integrity, who appears uncertain, is treated differently than a man of lesser integrity, who projects calm authority. This is not an injustice. It is a mechanism. Nietzsche understood that the prince who governed through reality alone, through the mere fact of his competence, without managing what others believed about him, was always more vulnerable than the prince who understood that appearance and substance had to be tended with equal care. In everyday life, this translates precisely. How you carry yourself in a room determines what others will permit themselves to do to you. Truth is not irrelevant. It is simply not sufficient on its own. The second rule follows directly. Control what people see, not what you feel. Emotional transparency, which we are often taught to celebrate as authenticity, functions in a world of mixed intentions as something closer to a map of your vulnerabilities. This is not a call toward coldness. Coldness is its own kind of weakness, rigid, brittle, easy to read in its own way. What Nietzsche was pointing toward was something more sophisticated, the capacity to feel fully, while choosing what to reveal and when. History is full of individuals who lost positions of influence, relationships of substance, and negotiations of consequence, not because they were wrong, but because they were legible at the wrong moment. They showed their frustration before they were ready to act on it. They revealed their attachment before they had secured what they needed. They expressed their fear to the very person who would use it against them. Emotional composure is not the suppression of feeling. It is the sovereign management of what you choose to make visible, and when. The third rule is one that most people resist the longest, because it seems to contradict everything they were taught about patience and grace. Do not respond softly to deliberate harm. The distinction here is critical, and Nietzsche was precise about it. He was not describing accidents, misunderstandings, the inevitable frictions of life lived alongside others. He was describing the calculated. He was describing the behavior that repeats after correction, that wears the costume of mistake while operating as strategy. What Nietzsche observed, and what behavioral psychology has since confirmed in different language, is that a weak response to deliberate harm does not teach restraint. It teaches escalation. It communicates that the cost of this action was acceptable, that the boundary it crossed was not truly a boundary. There is a particular kind of person who watches carefully when they test you. They are not looking for forgiveness. They are measuring the depth of what they can take. A clear, proportionate response to deliberate harm is not aggression. It is information. It is the establishment of a perimeter that changes what others calculate is possible with you. The fourth rule is one that speaks directly to the question of timing. The art of not revealing your full strength before you are ready to use it. Nietzsche observed that visibility creates targets. A man who shows all his capabilities early, who performs his full intelligence or ambition or resources before the environment is prepared to honor them, does not get admired. He gets managed. The people around him begin to calculate how to limit him, how to position themselves relative to what he represents, how to prevent the future he seems to be building. There is a patience that Nietzsche valued above almost everything else in matters of power. Not the patience of passivity, but the patience of deliberate concealment. The patience of someone who knows exactly what they are capable of and has chosen the right moment to make it known. Nietzsche described something adjacent to this in his concept of the self, who does not need external validation to know their own worth, who can sit quietly inside their strength without broadcasting it, without requiring others to recognize it before it is strategic to be recognized. This patience is not insecurity. It is perhaps the most mature form of confidence that exists. The fifth rule separates two things that human psychology tends to conflate: respect and affection. We treat them as though they travel together, as though the person who loves us will also honor us, as though the people who are warmest are the most reliable. But Nietzsche observed a different structural reality, one that history has illustrated with sufficient clarity that it should no longer surprise us. Affection is emotional. It rises and falls with mood, with circumstance, with how recently you have been useful or pleasant or familiar. Respect is structural. It is built through consistency, through the maintenance of boundaries, through the demonstration that certain things are not available to certain behaviors. Nietzsche wrote that it is better to be feared than loved, and this is the part that is most often quoted out of context and most often misunderstood. He was not advocating cruelty. He was making an observation about stability. Fear, in his usage, is closer to what we might call reverence. The recognition that this person has a center that will not bend regardless of pressure. Affection fluctuates. Respect, once genuinely established, holds. The relationships and positions built on respect are more durable than those built only on warmth. There is a question worth pausing on here, one that sits between the rules and deserves more than a passing mention. Why do so many people resist learning these things? Why does this worldview feel threatening rather than liberating? The answer is psychological, and it runs deep. There is enormous comfort in the belief that the world is fair, that sincerity is enough, that good intentions are a form of protection. That comfort is not trivial. It organizes life. It makes the future legible. It allows a person to act without the burden of constant vigilance. To give up that comfort is not a small thing. But Nietzsche was not asking anyone to become cynical. Cynicism is its own kind of naivety, a refusal to act because the world is imperfect, a collapse into passivity dressed up as wisdom. What he was offering was something harder and more valuable than either naive optimism or corrosive cynicism. He was offering clarity, the ability to see human nature as it is, not as a source of despair, but as a terrain that can be navigated by someone who has taken the trouble to learn its actual contours. Goodness does not disappear when awareness is added to it. It becomes stronger. It becomes less available to exploitation. It becomes, for the first time, genuinely sovereign. The sixth rule is about leverage and elevation. The understanding that the most powerful position is rarely the one engaged in every battle. Nietzsche observed that leaders who fought every conflict directly, who made their presence necessary in every confrontation, were exhausting themselves in ways that compounded over time. They were also making themselves predictable, making their limits visible, making clear exactly where they could be worn down. The more sophisticated approach, and history demonstrates this across every domain, from politics to commerce to the quieter competitions of social life, is to operate through position rather than through presence, to build systems, relationships, and reputations that work on your behalf, without requiring your constant engagement. This is not detachment, it is leverage. There is an intelligence in choosing which battles warrant your direct energy, and which are better handled through influence, through the elevation of allies, through the patient construction of circumstances that make confrontation unnecessary. The person who must fight every battle is someone whose position is still fragile. The person who can choose their battles is someone whose position has become structural. The seventh rule, and in many ways, the one that Nietzsche would have recognized as the deepest, is this: master your emotional center. The most durable form of power is not what you can do to others. It is what others can no longer do to you. This is where Nietzsche's strategic intelligence, philosophical psychology, converge on the same insight from different directions. Nietzsche spoke of the person who had become themselves so completely that external circumstances lost their power to define them, who could move through provocation without being provoked, through manipulation without being manipulated, through the full complexity of human darkness without being diminished by it. Not because they were numb, not because they had retreated into indifference, but because their center was stable enough that disruption could not find purchase. Nietzsche understood the same truth tactically. The ruler, who could be baited into emotional response, had already ceded the advantage to whoever held the bait. The capacity to remain composed, to think clearly under pressure, to refuse the emotional escalations that others construct specifically to destabilize you. This is not a talent. It is a discipline. It is the practice of returning, again and again, to a center that you have built deliberately and chosen consciously to defend. And here is what actually changes when someone moves through these 7 observations and comes out the other side with genuine understanding. They do not become harder. That is the fear. And it is wrong. They become clearer. The manipulation that once confused them becomes legible. They can see its structure before it fully deploys, can recognize the pattern in its early moves. The attacks that once wounded them become predictable. Not painless, but no longer surprising, no longer capable of dismantling their sense of what is real. The social world, which once seemed to operate by a mysterious logic that rewarded the wrong people and punished sincerity, begins to reveal its actual mechanics. Not as something to celebrate, but as something to navigate with intelligence and intention. Nietzsche's most devastating observation was not about power. It was about the cost of self-abandonment, the particular tragedy of a person who spends an entire life performing a version of themselves that was never truly theirs, who dies without ever having lived from their own center, without ever having stood fully inside their own values and vision, and looked at the world through eyes that had seen it clearly. Most people die that way, not from cruelty, not from defeat, from the accumulated weight of a map that was never accurate, a map drawn in someone else's hand, depicting a world that was never quite real, leading toward a self that was always a compromise between what they were and what they thought the world required them to be. What Nietzsche offered and what Nietzsche deepened in his own century, is not a permission to harm. It is a permission to see, to exchange the comfortable story for the accurate one, to stop being confused by human behavior that was never actually mysterious, only unseen. The greatest transformation does not happen when you defeat an enemy. It does not happen when you outmaneuver someone who meant you harm. It happens in a quieter moment, one that does not announce itself with drama or victory. It happens when you finally understand what someone is doing to you, and for the first time you feel nothing but clarity. No wound, no confusion, no desperate search for an explanation that makes it fair. Just the still, settled recognition of a pattern you have now fully seen, and from which, at last, you are free.